So folks, I'm Rosemary Wang, Chief Developer Advocate here at HashiCorp, and this is a Q&A with Armon. I don't know if we need to introduce you fully, so I'm going to ask a very awkward question, which is, do you have a fun fact about yourself you'd like to give to the folks here?
Oh, fun fact. Fun fact. Okay, I feel guilty admitting it, but I hate reading nonfiction.
Really?
I know. Everyone assumes that like they always give me like random business book tips, or they're like, you got to read all these like things, and I'm like, I hate reading nonfiction because I feel like so much of our day job is nonfiction that it's like my guilty pleasure. I'd rather read sci-fi or, something that's a little bit more of escapist.
Yeah. So you don't read those technical books that come in like free samples?
I have a pile of them, and I'm like one day I'll get to them probably.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. Actually, I have a pile of them in the basement, and I just haven't touched them.
Exactly.
So, all right. So let's get down to some serious business. What are some of your takeaways so far from HashiConf 2024?
Okay, I think there's been a few that's been interesting. I think one was around Terraform stacks. It's been interesting having a bunch of the conversations with folks, which is I think there's actually a bunch of other interesting problems that are almost organizational, I want to say, that I think we can start to solve with things like stacks. Of like, okay, if you have different teams owning parts of infrastructure, how do you kind of bring that into a logically integrated thing so that where it's like I think sometimes Terraform's almost fighting the org structure, where you're like, okay, how do you get multiple teams to align? And I think stacks can solve some of that. So I think that's been really interesting, that intersection of how org structure and technology kind of meet, and stacks being able to solve some of that. And then I think from kind of some of the day two stuff, I think the Vault Radar pieces have been, I think the feedback's been like, we thought we'd find 50, we found 5,000. So I think that's been super interesting too, and I think been a pretty consistent experience across customers.
Yeah, it's really funny because I just came from my session, and the joke that a teammate made to me was that it's really infrastructure lifestyle management and security lifestyle management, because really the problem isn't about the technology per se, it's about how organizationally, right, Conway's law, how you align along these boundaries and ensure you're transferring the right information to different people. So it's really
I like that, lifestyle management.
Yeah, lifestyle management. I was like, we should change all these things. All right, so we talk a lot about platform teams, especially in this track. We've heard a lot of customer stories talk about how platform teams have changed their organizations, right? How do you see the role of a platform team evolving as they enhance operational efficiency?
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. To me, I think, it's funny, I almost would go back to the definition of DevOps and how these things sort of relate to one another. To me, it's like I think there's always these two warring definitions of DevOps. One definition of DevOps was always your developers are your ops people, right? It's devs doing ops. And I think the challenge with that definition I always had was like, okay, but that assumes all your developers have the same expertise in networking and security and operations and all these things. And I think in most cases they don't, right? So then I think the other side of it, the sort of camp that I've always been from, is it's about, acknowledging that you have developers and operations, but it's about defining a contract between them, right? And so to me, when you think about that now in the context of platform engineering and this question of sort of platform teams, it's really about saying, okay, your ops team is really other software engineers, right? In some sense, we're taking a software mentality to it, where you're like, I'm building a product, it's API driven, I'm delivering self-service, and so I have a contract between my development and operations teams that's around, well, what are the set of abstractions, what are the set of interfaces, what are the set of artifacts I have that I want to standardize on, deliver as a shared service, and then enable my developers on. I'm not asking them to all become cloud experts. I'm asking them to be developers, but I'm going to enable them on what they want. So then to me, then it's the better we are at being crisp about what those contracts are, having clear ownership between those lines, and then driving higher levels of automation at the platform layer, what you're going to benefit from is sort of the standardization and the efficiency of scale. Right?
Yeah. And this is a tricky question because you talk about contract, right? And contracts, right? Microservices, contracts, et cetera, et cetera. We can talk about that endlessly. But do you think about whether or not we should prefer platform interfaces or abstractions?
I think it's a really good question. I think at the end of the day, because of the complexity of infrastructure, you're always going to have leaky abstractions. Because it's like, no matter how much you fight it, some of these details matter. Not for the average app, right? You might say, okay, whatever, a standard app doing web requests, whatever, maybe it doesn't matter. You can have a very airtight abstraction. But you start getting to complex infrastructure where you start caring about, well, what's my latency, my end users, because I'm doing video game streaming, or what's my I/O performance, or what's my threshold of tolerance on a transaction because I'm doing high frequency trades, whatever. And all of a sudden, you can't have that much of an airtight abstraction, right? Because you go, well, I need to know. Where am I running? What kind of hardware am I on? Do I have the right GPUs? So I think the wrong answer is trying to go perfect abstraction. I think it really is defining a set of interfaces, but then allowing the developers to look through as necessary, right? And I think that really feeds into things like our Waypoint philosophy. If you look at how we've designed it, yes, there's an interface that Waypoint's presenting, but you can click through directly and see, well, here's the Terraform workspace, here's the underlying module, here's the version. I can go all the way to Git and see the actual configuration of that module, right? So we're not trying to abstract it away. We're providing sort of a higher level interface to it and acknowledging that there are cases you have to look through. You will have to understand. There's no escaping.
Yeah.
There's bare metal somewhere.
Yeah, I like to call it as the escape hatch, right?
Yeah.
You give people an interface, but they need an escape hatch to see those internals sometimes,
Exactly.
right? And you usually, whenever I've chatted with you, you've done a really great job of articulating the interfaces, right, that we should consider for developers, right? You have this power users, and then you have the folks who are just like, just give me the infrastructure, right? Can you explain a little bit about how you think about the distribution of developers who are interested in these interfaces?
Yeah, I mean, so the way I like to think about it is I think about in any organization, you have sort of a bell curve of developer teams or even people, consumers of infrastructure, not necessarily just developers. And I think at the front tail, you have your super sophisticated folks. I call them the Hacker News crowd, right? They're reading Hacker News, they're attending HashiCorp or KubeCon or whatever, they care about the technology. And I think they're both high skill and high will, generally. They have the willingness to learn, they have the skills, they want to kind of go tackle this stuff. And so they're happy if you say, give me a CI/CD interface, give me GitOps, let me write infrastructure as code, I'm off to the race, right? So that's my one tail. Then you have the sort of whole middle of your bell curve, right? Then in many organizations, it's your traditional app dev team, right? They're like, hey, I'm a 15-year .NET developer, or 20-year Java developer, right? Whatever it is. And they either lack one of the will to learn some of these kind of cloud native tools, or they lack the skill, right? Because like, I've been Java dev for 20 years. I could barely SSH into a Linux machine and know what to do, right? And so I think whether it's one of will or skill, they can't operate in the same way the other folks can. And I think for us, that's where I think about things like golden patterns, golden workflows, really where we position Waypoint as an interface into infrastructure, where we're saying, don't worry about learning Terraform and cloud and Kubernetes and YAML and blah, blah, blah. Just tell us you want a Java app on Azure with a Mongo database. Great, that's the layer you should focus on. And then I think you have your other tail, maybe the long tail, and sometimes I'll call them, you can call them different things. It might be, maybe traditional system admins. It might be, business analysts who just says, I'm not an infrastructure person. I'm not a developer. I just need a Microsoft Power BI instance, or I need MS SQL, whatever. And for them, I think almost the right interface is a ticket, right? Because they're not a developer, right? They just say, give me an MS SQL. The ticket, and I'm putting ticket in quotes, should be automated in terms of the fulfillment. So it should still be infrastructure as code and yada, yada. But you can fundamentally see how one size doesn't fit all. I can't take any one of those interfaces and give it to the other two groups and have them be satisfied. If I take a ticket in front of the power user, they'll be pissed off. If I take the ISC pipeline and put it in front of the person who wants a ticket, they will have no idea what to do with it. And if I take the middle platform and give it to either of them, they'll both feel constrained, right? So to me, it's like once you acknowledge that you have these sort of fundamentally different personas, it's how do I have different front doors but a consistent platform, consistent IAC-driven approach.
Yeah, and I think what's worth considering is that even if you have a developer who uses Waypoint and has that interface, they again have that escape hatch as long as they're willing to take on a little bit of Terraform knowledge, right? And figure out how they're going to deploy and reorient their infrastructure on the Terraform side.
Well, this was always, I think, the challenge we saw with things like a Pivotal Cloud Foundry or something like that. You can build these platforms that have an abstraction, to your point, and when you hit the limit of that abstraction, that's the end of the line. There's nowhere to go, right? It's like you're either in or you're out, and there's no in between.
Right.
Versus the goal of Waypoint being an interface is if you hit the limit of that interface, to your point, you hit the eject button, and you hit eject and say, well, it's just Terraform. So here you go, write whatever Terraform you want. You can do whatever you want now. As long as you want to be on my paved path, you can be. But if you want to go off-road, great. Turn off traction control and do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. I guess on the other side, right, how do we think about this from a security standpoint, right? Think about developers and security. You made a lot of empty desk jokes over the past few days, but how do you think about that same kind of bell curve with respect to security and developers?
Oh man, then it's not even a bell curve. It's a very fat tail then in terms of caring and not caring.
Yeah.
I think to me, and this goes back to the conversation we had this morning with Dale and the way they think about it at SAP, and even the way we started maybe the keynote today, is I think the best approach to security is you have to make it integrated into the platform and basically make it there by default for the developer so they don't have to think about it, right? If it's a thing that you make a developer concern, A, it's cognitive burden for them, right? They don't want to learn, they don't really care. And B, it's really not what they are incentivized to care about, right? They're there to do feature delivery, bug fixes, solving problems for the business. So, worrying about rotating certificates is, it's the pinnacle of non-functional, drudgery, basically.
Yeah. No one wants
right.
to put that in their backlog, like rotate certificate, 2 weeks.
Yeah, exactly. So I think for me, it's like I look at it and say, the right answer is sort of that platform integrated approach to security where it's built in. So, as Dale said, great. If they're on their platform, the certs are delivered to them, they're rotated for them, the developer never thinks about it. That's the best case scenario. Developers doing the right thing without even knowing it, right?
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that I do is work with developers at organizations who adopt Vault, right? Because it's a paradigm shift from knowing you have static secrets to secrets that might auto-rotate, and now you have to reload your application. And I think the interesting thing is with HTTP Vault secrets, right? It doesn't matter what's happening with Vault, you just know that it's going to have auto-rotation, you get to put your secret in there, store it in there, you can synchronize it to interfaces you already know and understand, right? It could be your CI/CD framework, it could be a secrets manager and a CSP. So what is your perspective on almost abstracting away Vault in that manner, right? Making sure developers are using a completely different interface that's friendly, and you're kind of meeting that interface where they're at, right? It could be a CSP or a CI framework.
Yeah. No, I think that's, to me, is like, it goes back to the approach of like making it invisible is, to me, the goal, right? Like it needs to exist, obviously. Someone has to govern it, implement it, whatever, but it should be invisible to the developer. And so I think for me, as I even think about like longer range, it's like systems like Waypoint, the developer should say, okay, yeah, I picked Java and Mongo and Redis, but the fact that the Mongo database credential is being auto-rotated by Vault and the Redis credential is being auto-rotated by Vault and it's being materialized to that Java application should be invisible. It's just a part of the platform design. It's embedded in that golden pattern, but they didn't have to think about it. They just said, well, these are my app dependencies, and the fact that the Mongo credential is being auto-rotated every 30 days, developers shouldn't know or care.
Yeah.
Right? It should just be embedded and integrated into the platform.
Yeah, but admittedly, a platform is invisible, or supposed to be invisible until it's not,
Until
because
it's not.
something's broken. And so then that's where you have break glass operations, you have day 2 workflows. So can you explain a little bit of your perspective on why we standardize day 2? Because typically, I would just log into a machine or log into the production system and do what I want, right?
Yep.
There's no standardization of how I act on that system. So
Yeah.
why think about standardizing day 2 workflows?
Well, and I think this is one of the, I'll call it, biggest mistakes I see an organization make, is people over-focus on the day 0, day 1, because it's clear and present, right? When you're just getting started, you're like, okay, the most frustrating thing is like, I can't deploy the app because it takes 200 days and we have all these tickets and blah, blah, blah. Let's just focus on getting the day 1 problem solved. And so people will make that really fast and optimized, ignoring day 2. But then what you realize is day 1 happens once. You deployed the app once. But now you have 500 apps that you've deployed once, but you got to maintain them forever, right? And we got to work with many organizations that they've been around for, some of them 100 years. You're like, okay, well, how many apps do you still have that are 25, 30 years old, right? You have these ancient, apps still running on a mainframe or something. You're like, guess what? You're in day 55,000, right? So worrying about day 1, it doesn't really help you,
Yeah.
right? And so to me, when you look at where the calories are spent in an organization, 80% of your calories are day 2, day 3, day 4 operations. They're not deploy the app day 1. Mm-hmm. So optimizing and making day 1 great at the cost of the other 80% doesn't make a lot of sense. So to me, the way I look at it is if I can take 80% of my toil, which is day 2, and make that 50%, right? If I can shave 30% off of that toil, that's more than the entire 20% of my time I spent on the day 1 activity. Mm-hmm. Right? So how do I return that time back to the business? And that's where it's like, to me, it's like you need to actually over-focus on the day 2 challenge, because that's where all your calories go.
Yeah.
Unless you're a tiny startup and nothing exists, in which case it's all day 1.
Yeah, or all day, not day 1, or all day like 300. It's just
Right.
like everything broken and you go in and you
Right.
just go in and fix it. How does someone go about thinking about standardizing on these workflows, right? How do you identify some common actions that platform, dev, security might take, and these sort of break glass standard actions they might take in a system?
So I think, to me, it's like, I think about it as almost there's sort of this matrix of different people within every organization, right?
By the way, we forgot a whiteboard in here.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm going to whiteboard with my hands.
Yeah.
So you have sort of your, obviously you have your application development teams, right? Then I think about enterprise architecture. Then I think about platform and operations. And then I think about security and compliance. And so to me, the first arc in this is actually development teams and enterprise architecture, right? Which is, can you work with the app teams and enterprise architecture to say, well, what is the common set of patterns within the organization, right? Can we define 5, 10, 15 patterns for our application teams? And I do think that if you start getting into 20, 30, 50, you haven't done a good job patterning, right? Because there really just isn't that many, right? When you say, okay, you have a request response API-based app, you have a Kafka event-based app, you have a, whatever, you have only so many of these patterns, right? Enterprise service bus, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the goal is enterprise architecture needs to understand the app team's requirements, help work with them to define a set of those standards. Once you have them, then enterprise architecture can work with operations to define them as a set of golden modules, right? So now you say, I'm going to write the Terraform for 3-tier Java app, or I'm going to write the module for C# app backed with Kafka queue, whatever. And then you work with security and compliance to do all the reviews, build the controls, and get the sign-offs on that pattern. And now the relationship becomes great. If you're an app team and you're using one of my patterns, you're already blessed with security and compliance. You don't have to go talk to them. If you decide that pattern doesn't work for you, then great, you need to go have a direct conversation and go get those approvals and feel the brunt of that pain. Yeah. But not impose that pain on the platform teams. Because I think what often ends up happening is organizations get to a place where they say, dev teams have the freedom to do whatever they want, and they get to throw all the pain over the wall to the ops teams and platform teams, right? And so it's basically you've allowed the contract to be, I make a mess, you clean it up. In which case, what's my incentive not to make a mess? I have none, right? I'm going to keep.
That's a terrible contract.
It's a terrible contract, right? And then you can't be surprised when you're like, they keep making a mess. You're like, well, yeah, they have no incentive not to. So I think once you have that clarity of incentive, which is like, okay, I'm going to give it to you in a clean way, but if you make a mess, you own it. You break it, you own it, yeah. Right? And so to me, I think that's how I think about, you got to get those different personas aligned, yeah. Right? And then have that clarity of the sort of ownership to say, okay, you don't like the pattern, you're a special snowflake, then be a special snowflake, yeah. But you own the responsibility.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
You better be ready to learn what it takes to secure that infrastructure and to make sure that you're held accountable for
yeah.
it. Right? Yeah.
And all of a sudden what you find is the teams who thought they were special snowflakes, they're like, no, actually I'm just a 3-tier Java app. You're like, yeah, that's what I thought.
So speaking of 3-tier Java apps, a lot of organizations go through these cycles of like, platform version 1, that was like 10 years ago, yep. And then changed their mind, platform version 2 years after that, platform version 3, 2 years after that, right? They iterated on these patterns. They thought they knew the patterns. It turns out it didn't quite work. Someone new came in, built new platforms for it, et cetera, right? This platform evolution over time. And now we have a bunch of brownfield environments that are not standardized, right? Mm-hmm. They might be standardized within themselves, but not standardized as a whole. And now you're sitting here 10 years later thinking, okay, now I need a new platform, right, to standardize all of those other platforms that I thought I had correct, right? Yep. So how should organizations think about standardizing, right, their ILM and SLM across these multiple environments, especially brownfield environments?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? And the great thing about standards is so many to choose from, right? Yeah. And so I think what happens is a number of different things. One is I think if you don't get the contract right, and what I mean by that is oftentimes the contract focuses on the specific technology, then it's impossible to evolve the technology because what's happened is you've pinned it to such a specific set of things that there's no way to change it without breaking the contract itself. Versus, and I think this goes back to the way HashiCorp's always thought about, we think about workflows rather than technologies. What I really want to focus on is like, what's your actual intent? What's the outcome? Let me separate that from the technology. So to give you a good example, to me, it's like, okay, as an app developer, your intent is you're trying to run your .NET app. What you don't actually care about is it running on a VM? Is it running on a Kubernetes? Is it running on a serverless platform, right? Like, is it running in thin air, right? Like, do you actually care? Probably not, right? Like, from all practical purposes, you're like, here's my app. Is it running? Can it talk to its dependencies? Can its downstream reach it? That's really what I care about. Shouldn't matter. So to me, it's like you want to design it in such a way that you, as the platform teams, have the freedom to evolve that implementation because the technology will change. Right? And so if you say, okay, great, today I have a monolithic app running on a set of VMs, okay, great, I want to maybe preserve that and be able to bring that in. Tomorrow I decide I want to move to containers and Kubernetes, okay, great, I want to be able to preserve my ability as a platform team to make that architectural evolution without breaking my contract with every developer. right? And so that gets back to your point on sort of the interface and the abstraction, is if I can get that right, then I maintain the freedom. Yeah. So to me, that's kind of how I think about how you sort of have to drive that standardization. It's if the contract is, I'm telling you you're running on Kubernetes and it's a highly leaky abstraction, then I can never move you to a serverless platform, because that was my contract.
You've committed to Kubernetes.
You've committed. So now your only choice is I have to build the next platform, right? And now it's a migration, right? So to me, it's all, those two are very interrelated, as like, if your platform contract is wrong, then your only choice ends up being a re-platforming.
Yeah.
Versus if your platform contract is right, I can swap the implementation out and you don't have to be any wiser, right?
Exactly. All right, we're going to have one more final question, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. What is the next frontier for ILM and SLM that you see?
So, I mean, I think hopefully what people are starting to see for us is, we're starting to talk about the HashiCorp portfolio in a different way. If you were at HashiConf maybe a few years ago, you would have seen us talk a lot more about individual products, right? And I think what we're trying to really move towards is really thinking about infrastructure lifecycle management, security lifecycle management as more of an integrated continuum where, yes, there's many tasks to be done, and those tasks might be done by a different tool. Yeah, Packer might build a golden image, Terraform might provision the infrastructure, so on and so forth. But how do we integrate them together into really thinking about a more of a cohesive end-to-end solution, right? So I think that's, for us, been the biggest change, is going from a bunch of Legos where we're sort of saying, you piece it together however you want and figure out what it should look like, into saying, we've kind of pieced it together, here's how we think it should look like. If you don't like our opinion, that's fine. You don't have to take it, or it's not take it or leave it. But it's sort of up-leveling into a bit more of a solution-oriented mindset in terms of how we build the software, integrate it, deliver it as a shared service, basically.
Nice. All right. So I'd like to open the floor for questions. If you have a question, someone will pass you a microphone. You can ask your question, and then I will repeat it for the video playback. So just as a logistics note. Oh, we have one right here.
Hi, Beth Paraso, Tech Target. AI is a huge industry buzzword, except at this conference. What's your outlook on that hype cycle and where HashiCorp is going with that?
Sure, yeah, good question. So I kind of think about to me, there's sort of multiple layers of how we can leverage AI. Obviously, I think Horizon 1 is for us internally, we're Copilot users. Then Horizon 2 is sort of like, how do we embed it in our products? And then Horizon 3 is like, how do we enable our customers to leverage it, right? So that's kind of how I think about it. So internally, we're already leveraging various technology like Copilot. I think about Horizon 2, embedding it in the products. I think I think the challenge, as we've seen in a number of different cases, is there's a quantum leap between, I'll call it demoware and productionware. Very easy to build, a few API wires out to, pick your model of choice and build a demo. Very hard to translate that into truly a production grade thing you would trust. So I think that's where we've been a little bit more selective on picking areas of, I'll call them, manageable risk, right? So a good example is, generating tests for Terraform is a case where if the test is wrong, it's not production impacting. Generating Terraform and being wrong could be production impacting. So I think we want to be selective about where we sort of do some of that. The other side is, I think, rewinding a year maybe back, I think a lot of organizations were focused on, hey, we're going to go train a model to know our tools really well. I think the reality is the economics of that don't make sense unless you're a hyperscaler, right? Like, unless you're spending, $1 billion building your model, Amazon, Microsoft, Google are going to do a better job than you. So our view was, okay, rather than sort of say anyone's going to pay $10 a month for Terraform Copilot, it's how do we just work really closely with the cloud providers and train their foundation models to be first class. So we work behind the scenes to make sure we're providing training data, human reinforcement, documentation, all that kind of stuff into, the big models, if you will, so that, because our view is fundamentally every organization is either going to be whatever Copilot customer or Amazon Q or Google Gemini. If you're spending $20 a month per developer, you expect it to write everything from Java to C# to JSON to Terraform. You're not going to spend $10 a month just for the Terraform version. So it didn't make sense, I think, as we realized just how we think the industry is going to play out. It's better to sort of focus on making Terraform a first-class sort of member of those other ones. So that's kind of been where our focus has shifted. That makes it then obviously awkward to announce it because it's not really our model. It's, you're buying it from Microsoft or Amazon or whoever. So I think that's one side of it where we've seen a shift. Then that third horizon is how do we enable our customers to leverage AI, right? And so I think that's where you saw things like the Nomad announcements. We're working on things like, okay, great, how do we support the latest sort of NVIDIA multi-tenant hardware and support multi-instance scheduling and bin packing on those fleets? That's where we're seeing a lot of interesting use cases on sort of high-performance grids, training and inference on top of those clusters. So doing a bunch of work with Nomad, doing a bunch of work with Terraform, as you'd imagine, supporting things like all the sort of foundation models. I think we've recently put out some kind of reference architectures, and so I'll call them kind of maybe quick starts for people who want to set up, hey, I want SageMaker and Jupyter Notebook and this and that to have like, a data science and inference environment. So that's where we're working on basically enabling customers to kind of consume AI in a bit more of a prepackaged and opinionated way. So that's kind of maybe my answers, the three horizons. But yeah, great question. I knew I wasn't going to get out of here without an AI question.
I thought about asking you a question, and then I was like, you know what? I'm sure someone else will ask that for me.
Thank you, Armon, first for being the courageous visionary and helping our industry so much.
My pleasure.
So regulatory compliance is a big thing. FedRAMP, for some, StateRAMP, probably know where I'm going with this. Maybe you've heard of them. For compliance and a bunch of other reasons, what I would need to do the most is offload management of the control plane to HashiCorp or some other vendor.
Yep.
But I also need to be StateRAMP compliant, which means my external dependencies and vendors need to be compliant as well. That's a big thing, big ask. I'm curious, just is this something that has been identified as a strategic objective that is going to be taken, follow through on all the way? Or is this something that you're still like, I don't know, like Datadog had to make that market analysis that this was a sensible business profitable decision.
Right.
Are you still in that early phase, or is this something that you've decided, nope, we do need to do it, but it's a matter of time and aligning all the ducks?
Okay, great question. So maybe if I sort of paraphrase it a little bit, sort of how do we think about maybe things like FedRAMP, for example, on sort of the roadmap, and do we think about that as something we're committed to or something we would evaluate? So I think the way we sort of looked at it is I think the reality is we sell enterprise software to enterprise companies, and I think almost the vast majority of organizations, you have one or more regulatory requirements, right? Whether it's PCI, HIPAA, SOC, if you're in FedRAMP, right? And then you go overseas, you start thinking about common criteria and other things. And so I think the reality for us is, yes, there's a set of functional capability our customers are asking us for, right? Specific features and whatever workflows. But almost as often, if not more often now in HCP, we're getting asked about non-functional requirements, right? People are saying, okay, great, we love all these features, but until you have FedRAMP, can't use it. Until you have HIPAA and a hospital system, can't use it. So I think an enormous part of our roadmap is actually now pivoted over to that, right? Data sovereignty and data residency in Europe, right? So we announced earlier this year, for example, that we want to bring in HCP EU specifically to solve data residency challenges, right? So I think a very large portion of our roadmap, and I don't know if you might have heard our Chief Product Officer, Michael Weingartner, was talking on this track earlier. Big part of our focus is really pivoted to what we consider enterprise readiness, is sort of what we call that banner. And under that is basically we have a whole roadmap of sort of compliance targets when we think about, okay, you need data residency in Europe, which requires a separate region with segregation and blah, blah, blah. You need PCI, you need HIPAA, you need FedRAMP. So there's a not infinite roadmap of it, but a very long roadmap of a bunch of these things. And we think about it as there's a set of sequential targets, right? Some of these commercial targets are larger, addressable markets for us near term. So focusing on things like, a European region, PCI and HIPAA are larger opportunities. But FedRAMP, for example, is absolutely identified as a must-do. It's just a matter of sequencing.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, hi. This is Akshay from State Street. So right now we are in the middle of migrating all applications, almost like 2,000 applications to the cloud, AWS and Azure. And we're using Terraform and moving to TFE now. And one of the goals that we have is to do everything as a code. That means IAC, which is for creating and managing the resources, cloud resources, platform policy as a code. That means all governance using as a code, and also the operations as a code. And in my experience with respect to the operation as a code, simple thing like, let's say I want to do a DR, like I want to do the DR. The issue is that I have my workspace, which is doing the ISC, and then I have another workspace. It could be either a Terraform or Ansible or whatever. Yep. It actually introduces drift in my other thing. So basically, this looks like an impossible goal to me, that, okay, how can I do the operation as a code, while maintaining the sanity of my ISC. And I really don't know the interface between the two, right? So can you elaborate on that? How do we address this thing?
It's okay, yeah, it's a super good question. So maybe let me paraphrase it a little bit too, which is, as we think about sort of some of the more, I'll call it day two workflows, maybe things like disaster recovery and things like that, there can be a challenge of like, how do you codify some of that sort of operations as code, as well as how do you keep it consistent with things like infrastructure as code? Maybe it's a good way of summarizing. Yeah, could be backup, could be disaster recovery,
anything, yes.
Exactly. So I think it's a really good question, and I think actually it ties together maybe a few different themes, which is one, I think one of the directions we want to take things like stacks, Terraform stacks specifically, is making it a little bit more event-driven. So you might have an event that is like a backup event, a DR event, things like that, that then needs to trigger various orchestration. So one of the directions we're taking that is to enable basically a Terraform stack to basically be able to publish events into it and then be able to have that react and then to have multiple linkages of different environments. So you might have multiple workspaces, as you just said it, that could be linked to each other. So when some event happens in one, it actually needs to cascade to multiple other environments that need to be kept in sync. So there's a bunch of work we want to do around what does that look like to have sort of dependencies and linkages cross-stack and enable an evented-driven architecture. The other side of it is what opportunities are there to better connect, I think, tools like Terraform, which are really best suited as provisioning tools, with configuration management tools like Ansible, where you're using them most likely to do operations as code, right? When I think about runbooks, tends to be more of, that's something you use config management tooling like Chef, Puppet, Ansible for. And I think there's an opportunity for us to better integrate Terraform and config management so that you can have a bit more of an end-to-end experience. Today it's a bit disjointed. Terraform really understands about provisioning lifecycle. It doesn't really understand configuration management or day two operations as code. And so I think there's a bunch of stuff we want to work on next year to enable those to be much more tightly integrated so that you can have a bit more of that interlock, right? And not have to worry about, hey, I provisioned a thing here, but now it's not in my Ansible inventory, or it's not in my Chef and Puppet, and so my config management is drifting, basically. So yeah, great question. I think something we're looking at is like, how do we more tightly integrate across those?
I think that will be our last question for this session. Armon, thank you so much for joining us and taking time at the conclusion of this conference to chat.
Thank you
and
so
we look
much.
forward to speaking with you more.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you.